Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are getting our hands on Lecture 413 of the Tully's Long Digital Audio Series, and we are looking at this incredibly detailed analysis of Surah Maryam, specifically verses 22 through 39.
Yeah, and it is a profoundly deep well to draw from.
It really is. And our mission for you today is to basically completely strip away the magical Hollywood-style nativity story that you probably think you know.
Right, because that's the default, isn't it?
Exactly. And what we are replacing it with, based entirely on this lecture's analysis,
Yeah.
is a masterclass in what the author calls social physics.
Social physics, I just love that term.
Same. We are talking about organizational launch strategies, economic resilience in the face of just absolute despair, and the drafting of ironclad ideological manifestos.
It's just a massive shift in perspective. Like, we are taking a text that has been treated for, well, centuries as a literal, physical, supernatural event.
Yeah, miracle story.
Right, and we are fundamentally rewiring that understanding to look at the socio-political mechanics that are operating beneath the surface. It basically asks us to look at the anatomy of a revolution.
Right, and to really understand just how radical this rewiring is, we kind of have to establish the baseline. Like, we have to start with the traditional story that most of the world just accepts without question.
The one we all grew up with, yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
So we all know the dramatic, almost cinematic climax of this narrative. Maryam, or Mary, goes into literal physical labor. She's completely alone by a palm tree in this desolate place.
The isolation is a huge part of the traditional narrative.
Huge. And the pain is so excruciating, she literally wishes she were dead, just completely forgotten. Then, miraculously, a stream of water appears at her feet.
Just out of nowhere.
Right, out of nowhere. She eats some dates, gathers her strength, and walks back to her fiercely conservative, deeply patriarchal society holding a newborn baby.
Which is, a terrifying prospect in that context.
Oh, absolutely. And when the religious elite start accusing her of the worst possible crimes, this newborn baby magically sits up in a wicker cradle and just starts speaking in full, eloquent sentences to defend her virtue.
It really is an incredible Hollywood movie script.
It has all the elements.
It does. It has high fantasy, the isolated hero, the miraculous intervention, the talking infant.
The whole package.
Yeah, but according to the analysis we are dissecting today, while that makes for a beautiful, comforting story, it is a terrible misunderstanding of Quranic social physics.
A terrible misunderstanding. That's strong.
It is, but the lecture argues that the text is not describing a biological birth and a magical infant. It is describing the terrifying, agonizing moment an underground movement goes public.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I struggled to buy this right out of the gate.
Yeah.
Every major translation for 1,000 years has framed this as a literal birth.
Sure, it's deeply entrenched.
Right, so are we really supposed to believe that an entire civilization misunderstood a basic biological description? Or is this lecture just, reverse engineering a modern political definition to fit an ancient text?
That's a fair question.
Because claiming that labor actually means taking a startup public sounds like a massive stretch.
That is exactly the pushback you should have. It sounds like a stretch until you really dive into the linguistics and the historical context of how systemic change actually happened.
Okay, so take me through the linguistics then.
Let's start with the word used in the text, which is makad.
Makad.
Right. Traditionally, yes, this is translated as literal labor pains. But in the broader linguistic scope, particularly when applied to sociology, makad represents the intense, agonizing systemic pressures of birth.
Birth of what, though?
Not just of a human, but of an era, a system, or a movement.
So if I'm tracking this, the argument is that we are looking at the vulnerability of an idea.
Exactly. Think about how underground movements operate. Like when a revolutionary idea is kept among a small, trusted group.
When it's incubating.
Yeah, when it's incubating, it's relatively safe. You are in the planning phase. But the moment you decide to take that idea public, to challenge the established religious and political monopolies of the day, the societal pushback is violent.
They don't just let you disrupt things peacefully.
Never. The psychological and social pressure is immense. That pressure, that fear of exposure, and the impending clash with a ruthless elite, that is the makad.
Wow.
It's the birth pangs of a new social order. The author of the lecture argues that Maryam isn't suffering from biological contractions. She is suffering from the sheer, crushing terror of stepping into the public square to dismantle an empire.
That actually makes a lot of sense when you think about the psychology of whistleblowers
Yeah.
or like modern political dissidents.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Because you read accounts of people who are about to expose massive corruption, and they talk about the physical toll it takes, the nausea, the sleeplessness, the absolute dread.
The physical symptoms of extreme stress.
Right. And in the text, Miriam wishes she had been forgotten entirely before this moment.
Which is such a powerful statement.
It is. If she's just having a baby, that's an extreme reaction. But if she is about to walk into the center of a tyrannical religious establishment and declare their entire system invalid, I mean, wishing you didn't exist makes perfect psychological sense.
Completely.
It's the terror of the spotlight when you hold a truth that the establishment actively wants to destroy.
Precisely. And, this linguistic redefinition applies to the next massive roadblock in the traditional story, too, the cradle.
Ah, right, the wicker basket.
The text explicitly mentions the mod, which everyone translates as a literal cradle. So when Miriam brings this newborn movement to the religious establishment, the priests scoff and ask how they can speak to someone who is in the mod.
Right, and traditionally this is read as, how can we talk to an infant in a crib?
Mm.
But you're going to tell me Maud isn't a wicker baby cradle at all, aren't you?
No, it's not. And this is where the socio-political analysis just becomes so brilliant. Etymologically, mod is a foundational resting place, an incubator, an institutional base.
An institutional base.
Yeah, think about the phrase, the cradle of civilization.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Right. We don't mean a giant wooden crib where Mesopotamia slept. We mean the foundational starting point where complex society incubated.
So Maud is an incubator.
Mhm.
Okay, that shifts the entire power dynamic of the scene.
It does. Sociopolitically, the religious elite are just dripping with condescension. They are looking at this new ideological challenge, and they are saying, how can we, the grand established patriarchs of this ancient, deeply funded religious institution, debate with a movement that is still in its mod?
Like, you guys are just getting started.
Exactly. A movement that is still in the foundational, early, amateur stages of its development. They are dismissing the structural maturity of the movement.
It's like treating a massive ideological threat like a startup operating out of a garage.
That's exactly it. You don't even have a proper headquarters yet. Why should we listen to you?
Which brings us to the person they are refusing to listen to.
Okay.
The CEO of this startup, so to speak. The text refers to the Sabiya, traditionally translated as the baby or the youth.
Right.
So if the cradle is an incubator, who or what is the Sabiya?
The Sabiya is the newly minted youthful vanguard of this movement. Specifically, the lecture notes that Isa, or Jesus, was likely around 30 years old at the time of this public ideological clash.
30. Wait, but a 30-year-old is a full-grown man? How does a 30-year-old get labeled a baby in the text?
You really have to consider the context of the temple and the monopoly of the religious elite. The Pharisees, the scribes, the high priests, these are men in their 60s, 70s, 80s.
Right, the patriarchs.
Yeah, they have long, flowing white beards. They wear ornate, heavy robes of authority. Their entire power structure is built on seniority and ancestral tradition.
It's an old boys club.
Very much so. So to an 80-year-old entrenched priest whose authority relies entirely on age, a 30-year-old challenger who has just stepped onto the public stage is dismissively viewed as a mere child.
We're not going to debate a child.
Exactly.
It's such an age-old tactic to avoid addressing the actual arguments being presented. It's so much easier to attack someone's youth and perceived inexperience than to actually engage with their ideas.
We see it constantly.
We see this today constantly, yeah. Whenever a younger generation protests a systemic injustice, whether it's, climate policy or economic inequality, the immediate response from the establishment isn't to debate the policy.
Right. They never address the actual data.
Never. The response is, these kids don't know how the world works. They're naive.
Exactly. Calling him Sabiya is a calculated tactic of belittlement. But before we get to the actual debate, the moment this 30-year-old vanguard speaks and completely upends their dismissal, we have to look at the immediate aftermath of the Makkad.
Those intense pressures of going public.
Yes. Because the lecture points out something profoundly grounded about Miriam's experience by the palm tree.
Okay.
Verses 24 and 25 talk about a voice calling out to her from below, telling her not to grieve, instructing her to shake the trunk of the palm tree to get fresh dates, and pointing out a stream of water.
And traditionally, this is an angel magically providing sustenance.
Right.
I want to push back on this again, because this is a deeply beloved part of the narrative for billions of people.
It is a very comforting idea.
Yeah, the idea that in your darkest, most isolated moment, divine intervention will literally drop food into your lap. How does the lecture justify stripping the supernatural out of this specific moment?
By asking us to look at the actual physics of survival and movement building. The author of the Toli Islam lecture breaks this down as a vital lesson in economic resilience and active human agency under pressure.
Human agency.
Yes, the voice wasn't a disembodied cosmic entity waving a magic wand. It was a practical human presence. The analysis suggests this was likely the owner of the garden or a caretaker who happened to be nearby.
Oh, wow. So just a regular person.
A regular person. When Maryam is in this remote, desolate place, overwhelmed by the sheer terror of the mission ahead, this human presence offers two critical things: psychological support, saying do not grieve, and a reminder of physical sustenance.
And the physical sustenance requires her to actually do something. Like the voice tells her to shake the palm tree. It doesn't say, open your mouth and dates will magically fly in.
Precisely. It is about the active utilization of economic resources under pressure. A socio-political movement simply cannot survive on ideology alone. It requires tangible, empirical support systems.
You need funding, basically.
You need logistics, you need nourishment.
Right.
The garden owner pointing out the cool water and telling her to shake the tree is a reminder that even in the hardest phase of launching a movement, you cannot just wait for the universe to save you.
Right.
You have to look at the material reality around you and utilize the resources at hand. You have to shake the tree.
It totally grounds the entire narrative. I mean, it completely changes the lesson. If the lesson is angels will feed you, then the logical response to hardship is passive waiting.
Exactly, which is paralyzing.
But if the lesson is find the human allies in your periphery and physically extract the economic foundation available to sustain yourself, then the response to hardship is active resilience.
It demands action, and that action is what sustains the vanguard. So she has survived the psychological pressure of the Makkad. She is nourished. The movement is ready to face the public square.
Right. Time for the launch.
So Maryam returns to her people, which in this context means marching right up to the religious elite. And immediately they go on the offensive.
They don't even ask about her ideas. They attack her family's pious reputation. They say, your father wasn't a bad man, your mother wasn't unchaste, what have you done? It's an immediate character assassination.
Yes. And what is Maryam's response?
She points to the vanguard and says she has vowed a fast to the beneficent, a fast of silence. Sawman. Which honestly has always confused me.
Why is that?
Well, you are being publicly accused of terrible things by the most powerful men in your society. Why on earth would you vow a communication freeze? Why wouldn't you defend yourself?
Because, as the lecture explains, you simply do not engage in emotional mudslinging with a corrupt establishment.
Oh.
This is a masterclass in crisis communication and confronting bad faith actors. The religious elite in this scenario are not asking questions because they want to understand her movement.
Right, they don't care about the manifesto.
No, they are asking questions to trap her, to humiliate her, and to delegitimize the platform before it even starts. They are attacking her person, not her platform.
If she gets defensive, if she starts screaming about her innocence, she loses. She's playing their game.
Exactly. If you argue with someone whose only goal is to destroy your credibility, you legitimize their premise. So Maryam executes a strategic communication freeze.
The Sawman.
Right. By vowing a fast of silence, Sawman, she refuses to play their game on their terms. She doesn't try to explain the nuances of her situation to people who are actively, maliciously trying to destroy her.
That's powerful.
Instead, she simply points to the vanguard. She lets the functional output of her trained youth do the talking. She essentially says, I am not going to debate my personal character with you. If you have an issue with what we are bringing to the table, speak to the representative of our ideological platform.
It is the ultimate pivot. It's like a modern political campaign that refuses to answer a dirty smear tactic and instead just points to their published policy document. You want to talk? Talk to the manifesto.
Yes, exactly.
It takes incredible discipline to stay silent when you are being attacked. But it shifts the entire battleground.
Yeah.
And man, does the vanguard deliver.
Oh, absolutely.
The lecture provides a vivid, almost visceral description of what happens next. Picture this scene for you listening. The youthful vanguard, 30 years old, austere, uncompromised, standing on the steps of the Grand Temple.
It's a striking image.
Below him are the highest ranks of the religious elite, the Pharisees, the scribes, the men who literally write the rules of society to benefit themselves, draped in gold and heavy silk.
And this youthful vanguard doesn't hold back. He doesn't offer a polite academic debate. He unleashes a blistering critique of their systemic hypocrisy.
He goes right for the throat.
He points out that they wear specific religious garb to signify their holiness, but they completely ignore justice, mercy, and human rights. He calls them blind guides who strain out a gnat, meaning they obsess over tiny, insignificant ritual details, but they swallow a camel, meaning they commit massive systemic injustices without a second thought.
The imagery is so sharp. The text mentions the vanguard accusing them of washing the outside of their cups to look ritually pure, while the inside of the cup is filled with extortion and greed.
It's all performance.
He literally calls them whitewashed tombs.
Yeah.
Beautiful, bright, and clean on the outside, but inside, full of dead men's bones and decay.
This isn't a theological disagreement. This is a declaration of war on their economic and social corruption.
And what is truly fascinating here is how the lecture links this confrontation to the concept of Yom al-Hasra, the Day of Regret.
Yom al-Hasra. The vanguard isn't just delivering a moral sermon. He is delivering a structural warning. This is the exposition of the law of requital in action.
Let's break that down, because law of requital sounds like, academic jargon. What does that actually mean in the context of social physics?
The law of requital is the Quranic principle of absolute cause and effect in human societies.
Cause and effect.
Right. It is the idea that actions have inevitable consequences, not just as individuals in the afterlife, but as civilizations in the present world.
Yeah.
It is the physics applied to sociology. If you build a bridge with faulty steel, gravity will eventually tear it down.
Gravity doesn't negotiate.
The bridge doesn't care if you painted it beautifully or if you prayed over it. If the structure is weak, it collapses.
So if a society's elite build a system based on hypocrisy, economic extortion, and arbitrary religious fatwas that oppress the vulnerable, that system is structurally unsound. It is the faulty steel.
Precisely. The vanguard is warning them that if they refuse to listen to this functional empirical critique, if they ignore the realities of justice and equity, the law of requital will take over. And that leads inexorably to Yom al-Hasra.
Day of regret.
The day of absolute civilizational bankruptcy. The day their outdated, top-heavy, corrupt system collapses under its own weight, and they are left with nothing but regret. They will look back and realize that they ignored the empirical reality of their decay until it was too late.
It's the collapse of an empire from within.
Yeah.
Okay, so the vanguard has completely dismantled the moral authority of the establishment. He has exposed their hypocrisy in front of the public. He has pointed out the rot in their structural steel.
Yes.
But a movement can't just be against something. It has to be for something.
Yeah.
You can't just tear down the temple. You have to explain what you are going to build in its place.
Which brings us to the core of the lecture's analysis, the manifesto.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Verses 30 through 33. The religious elite, fuming, demand to know who this upstart is. And the youth defines himself to the furious elite with three incredibly specific structural pillars.
These are crucial.
Let's really unpack these, because this is where the sociopolitical blueprint becomes crystal clear. First, he declares himself Abdullah.
Abdullah translates literally to a servant of Allah. But in the socio-political context, the lecture interprets it as being a servant of the divine law.
Right.
This is a profound, incredibly dangerous political statement to make on the steps of the temple. By declaring himself Abdullah, he is emphatically stating what he is not.
Oh, that's key.
He is not a servant of the temple priests. He is not a servant of the Roman governor occupying their land. He is not bound by their man-made sharia, their arbitrary traditions, or their corporate monopolies. His allegiance is entirely to a higher, objective constitutional framework.
I don't work for you, and your rules don't apply to my conscience. That is a massive threat to an establishment that relies on absolute obedience.
It destabilizes their entire hierarchy.
When the power structure relies on people being afraid of the high priest, a man who publicly declares he only serves the universal law is a man who cannot be controlled.
It is the ultimate declaration of supreme independence from corrupt local authorities, and that leads directly to the second pillar of his defense. He says he is equipped with Al-Kitab.
Al-Kitab, the book. But again, following the logic of social physics, we have to look past the idea of a physical-bound manuscript and understand what it represents functionally in a society.
Yes, Al-Kitab is the written constitution. The vanguard is telling the elite, my movement is not based on the whims, moods, or arbitrary fatwas of religious scholars. It is grounded in a codified, objective, divine law.
A codified law.
Think about why a constitution is so important in any society. A constitution protects people from the tyranny of individuals. When the elite can make up rules as they go along, when they can declare something holy today and sinful tomorrow based on who pays them or what political alliance they need to make, the people are enslaved. Al-Qatar represents the rule of law.
It means the vanguard is bringing a predictable, equitable, and written standard of justice that applies equally to the high priest and the peasant.
No one is above it.
Right. A written constitution is the enemy of a dictator, whether that dictator wears a military uniform or a religious robe. You can't move the goalposts when the rules are permanently codified.
Exactly. And finally, the third pillar. He doesn't just have a theory, he has an operational plan. He states that he is establishing Salah and Zakah.
Salah and Zakah.
And as we might guess by now, the lecturer does not view these merely as private, mystical rituals where you quietly pray in a corner and give a few coins to charity.
Right. If you are challenging an empire, I'm going to pray and give to charity, isn't exactly a revolutionary threat. So how does the lecture define Salah and Zakah functionally?
If we connect this to the broader theme of social physics, Salah is the system of adherence. It is the organizational structure that keeps the society cohesive, disciplined, and moving toward a common goal.
Like the community infrastructure.
It's the network, the communication lines, the social fabric that binds a community together under the Constitution. And Zakah is the system of economic nourishment.
Okay, so money.
Yes, but more than that, it is the mechanism by which resources are circulated to ensure that no individual in the society is left stagnant or deprived. It's about growth, equitable distribution, and empirical societal health.
So the vanguard is saying my movement is grounded in empirical social reality. We are going to organize the people, Salah, and ensure their economic well-being, Zakah. It is a complete socioeconomic and political blueprint.
It's a new government, essentially.
It's not just let's pray more to feel spiritually fulfilled. It's let's build a parallel system of governance that actually takes care of human beings because your system has failed.
And what's remarkable is how the author of the lecture points out that the text deliberately frames this very pragmatic, highly structured manifesto in a way that destroys the theological dogmas that were invented after this historical moment.
This is a crucial point. The lecture argues that the text isn't just reporting history, it is preemptively dismantling future mythologies.
Yes, verses 34 and 35 are vital here. The analysis argues that the Quran meticulously details this historical socio-political manifesto to act as a corrective lens against later sectarian mythologies.
Like what?
Specifically, it dismantles the unproven mystical assertions of divine sonship or cosmic magic that were attached to the vanguard much later in history. The text explicitly says it is not befitting for the divine to take a son. From the perspective of this lecture's analysis of social physics, the divine law does not need biological offspring to execute its will.
Right.
It doesn't need a son to help out when it gets tired.
Right. The universe isn't a family business that needs an heir to keep the shop running. If a universe runs on laws, like gravity or the law of requital, those laws don't need a biological representative, they just function. And the lecture uses the phrase kun fayakun, be and it is, to explain this, which I love because traditionally people hear be and it is and think of a wizard casting a spell, poof, something appears out of nothing, but the analysis completely flips that on its head.
Indeed. The author clarifies that kun fayakun does not represent a magical wave of a wand. It represents the absolute unbending authority of systemic cause and effect.
Cause and effect again.
When divine law establishes a parameter, for instance, that societies based on equity will thrive and societies based on extortion will collapse, that law is absolute. Be and it is. The law executes itself through the natural, unbreakable mechanisms of the universe and human sociology. The vanguard's movement succeeds not because of cosmic magic, but because it aligns perfectly with the unbending structural laws of human flourishing. It relies on the engine of reason, not the tyranny of unproven assertions.
Now, I want to take a quick pause here and explicitly remind you, our listener, about the nature of our deep dive today. We are impartially reporting the analysis presented in this specific lecture from the Tolu-e-Islam series. The author is using socio-political definitions to systematically dismantle both traditionalist, deeply orthodox views of these verses, as well as specific sectarian dogmas of other faiths, like Christianity's concept of divine sonship.
And it's a very charged topic.
It is. We aren't taking a personal side on these theological debates. Our goal is to observe and convey the fascinating mechanics of how the author uses the concept of social physics to construct this argument. We are exploring the blueprint, provided in the source material to understand how a text can be read as a manual for civilizational change rather than a book of magic.
And that blueprint becomes incredibly urgent when the lecture shifts its focus from the ancient temple to the modern world, because the fatal flaw that destroyed the temple establishment is the exact same flaw the author sees crippling the modern Ummah, the global Muslim community.
Yes, this is where the historical analysis suddenly gets very contemporary and frankly very intense. It takes all of this ancient history and drops it right into the lap of the modern listener. The lecture draws a direct line from the historical collapse of the old religious elite to a fierce critique of modern sectarianism, or azab.
The author lays out a devastating constitutional argument. A religion, functioning as a system of social physics, simply cannot survive when it is divided into sects. The analogy used here is striking. Imagine a modern nation-state with a single foundational constitution.
Okay.
If a group of citizens suddenly declares that they're going to follow a completely different constitution while still living within the borders of that state, what do we call that?
In any country on earth, that is the literal definition of treason. You can't have a nation where half the population adheres to one supreme law and the other half adheres to something else entirely. The state would fracture and collapse into civil war.
Exactly. And the argument is that the Ummah is no different. You cannot have a global community that claims to be united under one constitutional law, Al-Kitab, the Quran, but is practically splintered into dozens of factions, each following their own sub-constitutions, their own historical fatwas, and their own sectarian leaders.
It's unsustainable.
Division is the architecture of collapse.
But how does one even measure that division? It's one thing to say we shouldn't be divided, everyone says that. But the lecture doesn't just talk about sectarianism in abstract philosophical terms. It provides a very specific physical metric for identifying this division. It brings in the architecture of division, literally.
Yes.
The argument is that the ultimate symbol and mechanism of sectarianism is the creation of separate mosques and separate prayers.
This is perhaps one of the most provocative points in the lecture. The author compares the modern phenomenon of sects building their own exclusive mosques to the historical Masjid Edirar, the Mosque of Harm, during the Prophet's time.
Let's give some context for that for listeners who might not be familiar with the Mosque of Harm.
Historically, a group built a mosque not for worship, but as a front to divide the community and conspire against it. The Quran explicitly condemned the building of that specific mosque because it wasn't built for unity. It was built as a staging ground for ideological division, a place to fester rebellion and cement a separate faction.
So it was a weapon, basically.
The lecture equates the modern act of building a separate ideological base, a mosque just for your specific sect, to division, and even to kufr or concealment of the truth, because it actively shatters the structural unity of the community.
That is a heavy, heavy accusation. If you build a space explicitly to separate yourself from the rest of the community based on your specific subsect's rules, if you say, we can't pray with them because they fold their hands differently than we do, you are functionally replicating the Mosque of Harm.
You are.
You are building monuments to your own division. And what I find fascinating is that the author of the Tului Islam text makes a point of applying this rule to themselves. The text highlights that their movement absolutely refuses to build their own separate mosques or mandate a separate form of namaz, prayer, for their followers.
Which is a remarkable exercise in intellectual consistency. The author realizes that the moment you build a Tului Islam mosque, you instantly cease to be a movement calling for universal unity under the Quran, and you just become one more sect in a crowded marketplace of sects. You fall into the very trap you are critiquing.
It's like writing a book about how terrible capitalism is and then selling it for $50 a copy. You undermine your own premise.
Precisely. The ultimate message here is that true systemic change requires absolute unity under one constitutional law. It cannot be achieved by a splintering of factions that spend their energy arguing over the right way to perform physical rituals while the broader societal structure burns down around them.
It's the difference between rearranging deck chairs on a sinking ship and actually fixing the hole in the hull. The temple elite in Maryam's time were obsessing over the deck chairs, washing the outsides of their cups, arguing over gnats, while the structural integrity of their civilization was collapsing, and the vanguard came in and pointed at the hole in the hull.
And that is the crux of the social physics we've been discussing. The vanguard didn't come to start a new sect. He came to reestablish the constitutional baseline of justice, adherence, and economic nourishment. He came to execute the social physics necessary to save a dying society.
So what does this all mean? Let's take a breath and look at the ground we've covered today, because it is massive. We started with a narrative that is almost universally read as a miraculous, passive nativity scene. A woman suffering alone, a magical infant speaking from a crib to save her.
A beautiful but passive story.
Right. And through the rigorous lens of this Tului Islam lecture, we have watched that narrative transform into a gritty, pragmatic, and highly strategic blueprint for a revolution. We've seen the agonizing psychological pressure of taking an underground movement public, the Makad.
The birth pangs.
We've seen the crucial need for an institutional base, the Mod. We've analyzed the strategic genius of a communication freeze, the Sawman, when dealing with bad faith actors. And we've witnessed a youthful vanguard step onto the public stage, absolutely dismantle a corrupt, hypocritical elite, and declare a new, constitutionally grounded manifesto of socioeconomic justice.
It is a profound paradigm shift. It moves the text from the realm of the supernatural, where we are just passive observers of magic, into the realm of the actionable, where we are participants in social change.
It's absolutely brilliant. So the new system has launched. Its manifesto is public. The old elite is standing on the temple steps, left completely speechless and exposed by this 30-year-old vanguard. But we know this struggle isn't localized. Taking down the local temple priests is one thing. But how does this blueprint for social physics scale when it confronts the grand civilizational structural patriarchs of inherited dogmas?
When it goes global.
Exactly. When the enemy isn't just the local elite, but the deep-seated ancestral structures of systemic delusion that govern entire empires.
That is precisely where this narrative is heading. That is where we see this system clash with the ultimate archetype of traditional authority. In Lecture 513, we move to Surah Maryam, Ayat 40, 41, and beyond. There, we will watch Abraham confront the massive, institutionalized ancestral structures of his time.
Oh, that's going to be intense.
It is scaling up the physics of revolution to an imperial level. I look forward to unpacking that with you. See you in the next lecture.
It's going to be incredible to see how the mechanics of this blueprint hold up against an empire. But before we wrap up today, I want to leave you, our listener, with a final thought to mull over. We've spent a lot of time today redefining the mod, the cradle. If the cradle isn't a wicker bed for a biological baby, but rather the fragile, easily dismissed incubator of a world-changing idea, what incubators in our own modern society are we currently ignoring?
That's a great question.
What underground movements, what youthful vanguards are we currently dismissing with a scoff, just because they look too young, too unpolished, or too inexperienced to challenge the established order? The next great shift in social physics might be germinating right now, in a mod we are too blind or too arrogant to recognize. Think about it. See you next time on The Deep Dive.